The wind came down off the ridge like it had somewhere to be, and it carried the smell of wood smoke and boiled cabbage across the yard of the Marrow Creek Home for Orphaned Children. Silas Cauley, 39 years old, sat his horse at the edge of the property and did not move for a long while.
They just need a
He had
proper
ridden
home.
2 days to get here, and he had not slept right in a month, not since the letter came. The letter had said his brother was dead. Consumption, the doctor's note explained, quiet and quick at the end. And his brother's wife had gone the winter before that, of a fever nobody named, which left 8 children. Silas's own blood ran through only 2 of them, his brother's boy and girl, but the other 6 had come to live under that roof over the years, the way strays come to a warm porch, and his brother had never once turned one away, and neither, apparently, had death asked which ones belonged, and which ones didn't, before it took both parents just the same. Silas swung down from the saddle. His knees ached from the ride. He was a broad man, sun-cured, with a beard he kept short and hands that had broken more horses than he could count. And he had never in his life wanted a house full of children. He had built a cattle operation out past the Wind River country with nothing but grit and 2 mules, and he had done it alone, and he had liked it that way. But there was liking a thing, and there was doing a thing, and Silas Cauley had come 300 miles because his brother's children had nobody else standing between them and the county. A woman met him on the porch steps. She introduced herself as Mrs. Adeline Ferris, 46 years old, the administrator of the home, and she had a face that had learned not to hope for good news, because good news rarely rode up to her door. She looked at Silas the way she looked at every stranger who came asking after children, like a fence line, checking for weak posts. "You'll be the uncle," she said. "I am. They've been asking after you. Wondered if you'd come at all." "I came." She led him inside, through a hallway that smelled of lye soap and cold biscuits, and into a parlor where 8 children sat in a row on 2 benches, like they'd been arranged for a photograph nobody wanted to take. The oldest was a girl of 14, sharp-eyed and holding the hand of the youngest, a boy of maybe 4, who didn't seem to understand yet what had happened to his world. Silas knew some of their names. Others he'd only heard mentioned in his brother's letters over the years. A boy taken in after his own folks moved on without him. Twin girls left at the county line by a family too poor to keep them. A boy who'd wandered in half-starved from a wagon train that never came back for him. 8 children. 8 lives strung together not by blood, mostly, but by the accident of having all landed under the same roof and the same tired, generous man's care. "Mr. Cauley," Mrs. Ferris said, once they were seated across from each other in her small office, the children sent back to their chores. "I want you to understand the situation plainly, because I find plain talk saves everyone grief later. The Territorial Placement Board has rules. A single man, unmarried, without a wife in the household, the board permits 1 child. 1. It's meant to protect the children, you understand. A household needs a woman's hand in it, they say, and a man alone can't properly see to 8. Silas sat very still. 1. 1, she confirmed. You could take the oldest, perhaps, since she's near enough grown to help you keep house. Or the youngest, if it's sentiment you're after. The other 7 would stay here, or go on to placements as they come. Some might find homes together, most won't. You're telling me to pick. I'm telling you what the law allows." Silas looked past her, out the window, to where he could see the children again in the yard now, the older ones minding the younger, the twin girls with their heads bent together over something small in the grass, the 4-year-old boy chasing a chicken with the single-minded joy of a child who has not yet learned that grief is supposed to slow a person down. He thought about his brother, who had never once counted whose blood ran in a child before he fed them. He stood up. The chair scraped back hard enough that Mrs. Ferris flinched. "No," he said. "Mr. Cauley, I did not ride 300 miles to leave 7 children in a home that smells like it's already given up on them." His voice had gone low and hard, the voice he used on a spooked horse or a man who needed telling twice. He brought his fist down on the edge of her desk, not violent, not meant to frighten, but final, the way a man closes a gate he intends to stay closed. "I will not leave 8 behind, not one of them. Not while I've got breath in me and land enough to feed them." Mrs. Ferris did not answer right away. In her years running the home, she had heard every manner of promise from every manner of man, and most of them had worn thin somewhere on the road between her office and the front gate. She had learned to distrust big talk, because big talk was cheap and children were not. "The board will not allow it," she said again, quieter now. I don't make the rule, Mr. Cauley. I only enforce it. Then I'll take it up with the board myself. You'll lose. Maybe, Silas said, but I'll lose loud. He left her office and did not go far, only out to the porch, where he sat down on the top step with his hat in his hands and watched the children a while longer. The oldest girl, whose name he now knew was Ruth, came and sat a careful distance from him, the way a person sits near a stranger they are still deciding about. "You're really our uncle?" she asked. "I am. Papa used to talk about you. Said you were too stubborn to farm and too honest to steal cattle, so you took up ranching instead." Despite everything, Silas found himself almost smiling. That sounds like something he'd say. "Are you going to take one of us?" The question sat between them, plain and unafraid, the way children ask the things adults spend a lifetime learning to dodge. Silas looked at her, 14 years old, holding herself together for the sake of the younger ones, already carrying more than her share. "I'm going to take all of you," he said. "It might take some doing, but I'm not leaving without every last one of you, and that includes you, Ruth, and it includes that boy chasing the chicken, and everyone in between." Ruth's eyes went bright and wet, though she did not let herself cry. "The board won't like that." "The board," Silas said, "can write me a strongly worded letter." That evening, before he rode back to the boarding house in town, where he'd taken a room, Silas walked the length of the yard and met each of the children in turn, the way a man walks a fence line before he decides to buy the land behind it. The twin girls, Margaret and Susanna, 11 years old, finished each other's sentences and regarded him with matching suspicion until he asked after the small thing they'd been examining in the grass. A beetle, it turned out, one they'd named and were keeping in a jar with holes punched in the lid. He asked its name with the same gravity he'd have asked after a prize bull, and something in both girls eased at that. The wagon train boy, whose name was Thomas, was 12 years old and had the wary stillness of a child who had learned that grown-ups came and went, and it did not pay to trust the coming too quickly. He did not speak to Silas that first evening at all. He only watched, from the porch rail, the way a man might watch weather building on the horizon, uncertain yet whether it meant rain or only wind. "That one doesn't talk much," Ruth said, following Silas's gaze. "He will," Silas said, "when he decides I'm staying." The first hearing before the board went about as badly as a hearing could go, without ending in outright refusal. Bellinger's 4 fellow board members were, if anything, less inclined toward sentiment than the chairman himself, a banker from the county seat who measured every proposal in terms of cost, a minister who spoke at length about the sanctity of a proper household without ever quite defining what made a household proper, and 2 ranchers who eyed Silas's modest holdings and wondered aloud whether a man with his own herd to tend could spare the attention 8 children required. "You run cattle," the banker said. "Cattle don't ask for schooling, or doctoring when they're feverish, or shoes that fit before they're outgrown again in a season. Have you costed this out, Mr. Cauley, or only felt it?" "I've costed it," Silas said, and he'd spent 3 nights at the boarding house with a ledger and a stub of pencil, working the numbers by lamplight until his eyes ached, because he had known this question was coming, and he had not intended to arrive with only his conviction and nothing behind it. He laid out the figures plainly, the size of his herd, the yield of his land, the addition he meant to build onto the house, the wages he could offer Mrs. Voss. "I don't say it'll be easy. I say it's possible, and I say I intend to do it, whether this board sets its blessing on it or not, because there's no rule on your books that can make me leave without my brother's children. You can only decide whether you'll help me do it properly, with the board's sanction, or make me do it anyway and call it defiance." The minister did not care for that answer. The banker seemed, grudgingly, to respect it. Bellinger said nothing at all, which was, Silas would come to learn, the judge's particular habit when a thing had lodged itself somewhere he had not expected. The board adjourned without a ruling that day, and again the next time Silas came before them, and the delay wore on him more than any outright refusal might have, because a refusal at least gives a man something to push against, while silence only gives him more nights to lie awake wondering. It took him the better part of 6 weeks to make it happen, and none of those weeks were easy. The Territorial Placement Board met in the county seat, a half-day's ride from Marrow Creek, in a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and self-importance. Silas rode in every time they'd see him, hat in hand, and made his case to 5 men behind a long table who mostly wanted him gone so they could get on with their supper. The chairman of the board was a man named Everett Bellinger, 61 years old, a former circuit judge with a reputation for going by the letter of the law and nothing softer than that. He had denied more placement requests than he had approved, on the theory, often stated, that a poor placement did more harm to a child than no placement at all, and that sentiment was no substitute for sound judgment. "You're asking this board to set aside a rule that exists to protect children," Bellinger said, the first time Silas stood before him. "A bachelor with 8 dependents and no woman in the house. I've seen that arrangement fail before, Mr. Cauley. I've seen the children pay for it. I've got a housekeeper coming on, a widow from Laramie, with grown children of her own, who's agreed to help see to the little ones," Silas said. "I've got a spread of land big enough that no child will go hungry or want for a bed. I've got references from every rancher and preacher within 40 miles of my property who'll vouch for my character. What I don't have, Judge Bellinger, is any intention of walking out of this territory without every one of my brother's children." "Sentiment," Bellinger said, "is not a placement plan." "No," Silas agreed, "but it's what got my brother out of bed every morning for 15 years to feed children that weren't his own blood, and I don't see the harm in a man following his kin's example." Bellinger was not moved that day, nor the next time Silas came, nor the time after that. But something in the old judge's face changed, slowly, over those weeks, the way stone changes under years of water, rather than all at once. Silas did not know it, but Bellinger had once, long ago, been party to a placement decision that split a family of 5 children across 3 counties, and none of the 5 had ever found each other again as adults, and the judge had carried that particular ruling like a stone in his boot for 30 years without ever once saying so aloud. What turned things, in the end, was not a courtroom argument at all. Bellinger came out to Marrow Creek unannounced on a gray Tuesday, meaning to inspect the situation for himself before the board's final ruling, expecting to find chaos, or neglect, or the kind of desperate scrambling a man puts on for company. Instead, he found Silas up to his elbows in flour, attempting with limited success to teach the twin girls how to make biscuits, while Ruth kept order among the younger ones at the table, and the widow from Laramie, whose name was Mrs. Hattie Voss, 49 years old, sat mending a torn shirt by the window with the unhurried competence of a woman who had raised 5 of her own. The 4-year-old boy, whose name was Daniel, marched straight up to Bellinger with a biscuit in his fist, mostly raw in the middle, and offered it to him with the solemn generosity only very young children manage. "Made it myself," Daniel announced. Bellinger, 61 years old and unaccustomed to being disarmed by anyone, took the biscuit and ate it, raw middle and all, standing in the doorway of a house that was loud and a little chaotic and entirely unmistakably a home. He did not say much that visit, but 3 days later, the board's ruling came through, granting Silas Cauley guardianship of all 8 children, with a note appended in Bellinger's own hand acknowledging that some rules exist to protect what matters, and some situations show a man exactly why the rule was never meant to stand in that particular doorway. Thomas did not speak a word to Silas for the better part of 2 months after the family settled onto the ranch. He did his chores without complaint, ate his meals without comment, and watched everything with the same careful distance he'd shown that first evening on the porch rail. Silas did not push him. He had learned over a lifetime of gentling spooked horses that the surest way to lose a wary creature's trust was to chase it, and so he let Thomas keep his distance, and simply made certain the boy always had a place at the table and a job worth doing. It was Daniel who finally broke through. In the unthinking way of very young children who have not yet learned caution is a thing to practice. The boy wandered off toward the creek one spring afternoon, while the older children were occupied with chores, and it was Thomas who noticed him missing first, and Thomas who ran the quarter-mile to the water without stopping to fetch a grown-up, and Thomas who pulled Daniel out of the shallows where he'd slipped on a wet stone and gone under just long enough to frighten but not to harm. Silas found them both soaked through and shivering on the bank, Thomas holding Daniel against his chest with the fierce, unthinking grip of someone who has just understood, all at once, what it means to have something worth losing. Silas did not scold. He wrapped his coat around both boys and carried Daniel back to the house himself, and that night, for the first time, Thomas sat close beside him at supper instead of at the far end of the table, and asked him, quiet enough that only Silas could hear, whether he might be permitted to keep his brother's, he corrected himself, his cousin's, old fishing pole, since nobody else seemed to want it. "It's yours," Silas told him. "Everything under this roof is yours, Thomas, has been since the day you came to it." The years that followed were not without hardship. There were droughts and a hard winter that tested every plank of the house Silas built onto twice its original size, and the ordinary griefs of children growing up without the parents who should have seen them do it. But there was also Ruth, who grew into a young woman capable and steady, teaching the younger ones their letters at the kitchen table by lamplight. There was Daniel, who never did learn to make a biscuit that wasn't raw in the middle, and never stopped trying. There were the twin girls, and the boy from the wagon train, and all the rest of them, each one finding their particular place in a household that had been built, against every rule written down on paper, on the simple, stubborn refusal of one man to leave anybody behind. Silas never did remarry, though Mrs. Voss stayed on long past the point anyone would have called it necessary, and there were those in town who suspected an understanding between them that neither ever confirmed nor denied. He grew old the way his brother had, surrounded and generous, and never once counting whose blood ran in the children who called him Pa. Judge Bellinger came to visit every autumn after that first one, always finding some pretext of business that happened to bring him past Marrow Creek way, and he never left without a biscuit in his hand, raw middle and all, and a seat at a table that had, in his considered legal opinion, turned out to be exactly the right shape for the family sitting around it.